She's the best girl in school. He was the top student. And this isn't the first time Carl's helped Annie. Just yesterday, Annie stood alone by the bridge because her sister died in a car accident here. And under her sister's protection, Annie survived without a scratch. And today was her sister's birthday. She didn't want to be alone anymore. But then Carl saw her. Carl climbed up. He pretended to have one foot in the air, scared Annie into stopping him. Carl said she cared about other people's lives. Why would she give up her own? And then Carl slowly extended his right hand. And that's how Carl entered Annie's world. When the teacher asked for a report in pairs after class, Carl rushed to ask Annie to join him. But Annie said she wouldn't do it. Carl was not discouraged. Instead, he wrote in a note, "She smiled at me today." Annie turned on her cell phone. It was Carl. He said he just wanted to make sure Annie was still alive, and he'd written a song about her. But Annie's frown grew. She asked Carl why he was doing this. Carl said he was willing to help her out, and invited her out for a walk. They walked quietly under the night sky. Carl asked her to join him again. This time, Annie didn't say no. There was even a smile on her face when they parted. Early the next morning, the two of them rode freely down a country road. Annie couldn't believe it. The sight they were describing was a broken rock. Carl jumped up and down on it with glee. He said there would be a different view from a different angle. Annie realized there was still nothing there, but for some reason, it made her feel lighter. And she and Carl couldn't stop laughing. We spent the rest of the evening chatting. Suddenly, Annie heard something outside her window, and there was Carl. The two of them were talking about life under the streetlight. That day, Annie found a stone in the cupboard. It said, "It's your turn." She asked Carl what he meant by giving it to her. Carl said that the rest of her life would be her own. He wanted Annie to be happy for the rest of her life. Annie was so touched. She and Carl went on a road trip, but in the car, she was nervous. At the crucial moment, Carl held her hand tightly, and he helped to stabilize her. The two of them had fun on the roller coaster. Annie fell in love with this gentle, caring boy. They kissed in the field, but Annie didn't notice the sadness in Carl's eyes. Carl didn't show up for school on Monday. He didn't answer his texts. Annie checked with his friends, but they said he did it all the time. They called him a freak. But the next day, she found Carl talking to her parents. Annie asked Carl why he suddenly disappeared. Carl slowly opened the car door and looked at the car full of flowers. Annie couldn't help but smile. Carl took Annie to a small lake. He said it seemed to lead to another world. The two of them swam in the lake together, playing like children. Annie asked Carl what he was most afraid of. Carl laughed and said it was probably his father. His father used to beat him when he was a child. He suffered from a serious mental illness. He was miserable every day of his life. He even sank in the bathtub, wanted to end this terrible life. So he kept writing notes to remind himself to calm down. Annie didn't realize that Carl would have such a painful experience. It was her turn to heal Carl's broken heart. Early the next morning, Annie was in a panic to get up and go home. When she arrived, she found her parents in a frenzy. Annie did her best to explain, but her father told Carl to get the hell out of there. Carl felt that he was the one who had put Annie through the ringer. He tore up the note on the wall with all his might. The next day, when Carl arrived at school, the next day to see a boy talking to Annie, he held back his anger and dragged Annie away. But the boy said, "He's a freak." Carl couldn't hold back his anger any longer. He walked back and pinned him to the ground. Annie screamed at Carl in a frenzy. Carl didn't realize that he'd show his violent side. He just turned around and walked away. He went crazy in the car. Annie rushed to Carl's house and said she wanted to help him with his pain. But Carl didn't want to drag her down with him, so he yelled at Annie. Annie was so scared, she ran away. Carl looked at the stone he'd given Annie. He lost all light in his heart. Annie anxiously called Carl's phone, but there was no answer. But Carl had really disappeared. Annie drove to the lake to look for him, but all she could see was a scattering of clothes. She screamed out into the lake, but there was no answer. We met again at Carl's funeral. He was gone. As each day passed, the longing for him grew stronger. Annie started writing notes. She wanted to write down every day's feelings and tell them to Carl.